Michael Bennett, a millionaire businessman known for his cold and calculating nature, accepts a bet during a dinner with friends to marry a homeless woman just to prove that money can buy anything, even people. That's how he meets Grace Walker, a woman scarred by life, carrying invisible wounds and a story no one has ever bothered to hear. What was meant to be a meaningless game turns into something far more profound when, on their wedding night, Grace reveals a secret that shatters all of Michael's certainties. Amid clashes, prejudice, and the harsh reality of social inequality, Michael is forced to face a truth his money can never erase. Night falls over the city. Prime 71, the epitome of luxury dining, echoes with laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses. At a private table, 3 men toast with expensive wine. At the center sits Michael Bennett, 38 years old, dressed in a flawless suit, a 6-figure Swiss watch on his wrist, and a gaze that declares, "The world is mine." Beside him are Brian Carter, his longtime friend and the family's lawyer, and Sebastian Miller, a cynical investor with a razor-sharp tongue. Brian raises his glass. To the man who turns everything into profit. Sebastian, ever the provocateur, smirks. "I'd say, even people, if he wanted to." Michael responds with a cutting smile. "People have a price. You just have to make the right offer." Brian, intrigued, leans in. "And what if it was someone with nothing at all?" Sebastian joins the game. "I bet even a homeless woman would say yes, if the check was big enough." Michael, with the cool certainty of a man who never loses. "It's simple. Everyone has a number." Brian narrows his eyes, sensing the arrogance in his friend's voice. He challenges him. "Then prove it. Marry someone who has absolutely nothing. No prenup, no loopholes, 30 days. At the end, give her $100,000. Sebastian adds, his tone dripping with malice. "Or is your money only good for those already willing to be bought?" Michael's pride flares. He doesn't back down. Done. 30 days. With a handshake, they seal not just a bet, but the fate of 2 lives. 2 days later, Michael drives into one of the city's roughest neighborhoods. The low growl of his BMW stands in stark contrast to the distant echoes of people begging for help. The sidewalks are lined with makeshift tents. He observes in silence until his eyes land on Grace Walker, 32 years old. She sits wrapped in a filthy blanket, holding a simple sign, "Hungry. Any help is appreciated." Her face is marked by the sun and time, but her eyes hold a resilience no passerby ever notices. Michael approaches, hands in his pockets. "Would you like to change your life?" Grace doesn't look up. "If this is another lecture or empty promise, keep walking." Michael, straight to the point. "Marry me, 30 days, and at the end, $100,000. Grace lets out a bitter laugh. "You're serious? Marriage? Why?" Michael, "Because I want to, and you need to." Grace finally meets his gaze, her eyes as sharp as blades. "Why me?" "Because you were here." The night is heavy with heat. The filthy pavement holds the day's warmth, the air thick with the scent of garbage and exhaust fumes. In the distance, car horns and voices create a harsh soundtrack to the most absurd conversation of Grace's life. She tightens her grip on the sign in her hands. "Hungry. Any help is appreciated." The paper is damp, frayed, just like her life. Dirty, fragile, on the verge of falling apart. In front of her, Michael Bennett remains unfazed, as if closing another business deal. His proposal lingers in the air, heavy. "Marry me. 30 days. $100,000. Grace tastes bile rising in her throat. Her stomach growls, the hunger so familiar it feels like part of her identity. But this man, in his pristine suit and steel-like gaze, seems incapable of understanding what his offer truly costs. Is this some kind of joke? She spits the words out, as if trying to rid herself of the filth of his offer. Michael doesn't even blink. "No, it's a deal. Simple." Grace laughs, but it's dry, joyless. "Marriage isn't a business. Everything is a business. Marriage too. I'm just being honest about it." Grace feels her legs tremble. Her mind spins, heavy. $100,000. With that money, maybe she could find him. Her heart clenches at the thought. It's been nearly 3 years since she last heard from her son, Luke. The last time she saw him was through the window of a shelter, his tiny hands pressed against the glass as he watched his mother being taken away by a social services worker. Michael's cold voice cuts through her thoughts. I can find someone else, but I doubt anyone needs this more than you. Grace feels her blood boil. This man thinks she's disposable, a cheap piece to be traded. But he's right about one thing. She does need it. She clenches her fists. It's not the proposal that humiliates her. It's the reality that forced her to consider it. $100,000 after 30 days? Her voice is tense. Yes. Michael keeps his tone neutral. And what do you expect from me? Michael studies her with a faint smile as if assessing an investment. Just play the role. Proper behavior. Photos. Appearance. Nothing more than any trophy wife would do. Grace meets his gaze head-on. No charm, no deception, just a transaction. And if I say no? She challenges. Michael doesn't hesitate. I'll find someone else. And you? His eyes drift over the makeshift tents, the exhausted faces. Grace's chest tightens. The word dignity lingers bitterly in her mind. Dignity, as if someone who sleeps on cold concrete, invisible to the world, still has a grip on that. She thinks of all the times she was turned away from jobs because her clothes were too worn, all the doors that shut in her face, all the times she held back the gnawing hunger because asking more than once in the same day came with looks that burned worse than starvation. And then she thinks of Luke, her little Luke, with big eyes and messy hair, the only part of her life that still made sense. The system took him away, saying she wasn't fit to raise a child. But they never took her love for him. And if this money was the way to find him, to start over? Grace lifts her eyes to Michael. Hunger, pain, anger, all of it simmers inside her, but her voice comes out steady. I accept. Michael raises an eyebrow, almost surprised. Good. But Grace lifts a hand, slicing through the air. On one condition. Michael folds his arms, intrigued. I'm listening. I am not your property. Her voice is steel. You bought my time, not who I am. The corner of Michael's mouth lifts in the slightest smirk. Deal. He extends his hand. Grace looks at it but doesn't take it. I don't make deals with handshakes. She turns and walks toward his car, leaving him behind. Michael smiles. There's something different about her, and he has a feeling this bet just got a lot more interesting. The interior of the BMW is a world apart. The scent of expensive leather, the gleaming dashboard. Grace feels out of place. Her shirt smells like the street, and her dirt-streaked hands contrast sharply with the pristine leather seats. Michael gets in, starting the engine with a single touch. The silence between them is thick. Grace watches the city pass by through the window. Glass towers, billboards, stores that sell a single shirt for the price of months of rent, if she even had a home anymore. In case you're wondering, she says, breaking the silence, this is no victory. Michael, eyes on the road. I know. I doubt that. She turns to him. To you, I'm just an experiment. And to you, what am I? He asks, a slight smirk playing on his lips. Grace doesn't hesitate. A price too high to pay. The car pulls up in front of the St. Regis, one of the city's most luxurious hotels. Grace feels the weight of the doorman's gaze as he hesitates before opening the door. Inside, the marble gleams as if even the floor belongs to another world. The people, men in tailored suits, women in high heels, look at her the way someone looks at something out of place. At the reception desk, a woman in a flawless uniform raises an eyebrow at Grace. Can I help you, miss? Her expression suggests a different question. Are you sure you belong here? Grace, head held high, replies, You can, with less judgment. Behind her, Michael watches in silence and feels something. He's used to being the strongest presence in any room. But Grace, she faces the world head-on, even when it tries to trample her. In the suite, Grace stands before the panoramic window. The city sprawls before her, a sea of lights, and she's just an invisible speck. On the bed there are new clothes, expensive, from brands she can't even pronounce. She touches the fabric, feeling its unnatural softness. She slips on the dress and looks at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back is a stranger, polished but empty. Michael enters without knocking, his eyes scanning her. But instead of admiration, there's evaluation, like someone inspecting a finished product. Ready for the show? He asks, a trace of sarcasm in his voice. Grace meets his gaze in the mirror. Ready for the circus? Just don't forget who the clown is. Michael smirks. Interesting. Grace turns to him. Let's see how long this interesting lasts. And in that moment, they both know. This won't just be a bet. The car engine goes quiet in front of the St. Regis, a symbol of wealth that both shapes and divides worlds. The doorman, in his pristine white gloves, rushes to open the door, but hesitates when he sees Grace. She steps out, feeling his gaze, not one of curiosity, but of judgment. It's a look she knows well, the same one she's faced when asking for a glass of water at a cafe or trying to step inside a store just to escape the rain. The borrowed heels sink slightly into the plush carpet at the entrance, her simple clothes clashing with the gleaming lobby. Michael steps out effortlessly, as if the world is his stage. Grace, on the other hand, feels the weight of every step. The echo of her heels on marble amplifies her discomfort. At the front desk, a woman with a perfectly styled bun and a rehearsed smile sizes her up. The smile doesn't reach her eyes. "Can I help you, ma'am?" The pause before ma'am is subtle, but sharp. Grace doesn't lower her head. She's survived worse than judgmental stares. "You can, with less judgment." The receptionist's smile stiffens for a second but quickly resets. "Of course. Name on the reservation?" Michael answers before she can. "Michael Bennett, Presidential Suite." In an instant, the receptionist's demeanor shifts, like a mask being swapped. "Mr. Bennett, it's a pleasure." And then, with the kind of warmth only the wealthy receive, she adds, "Your suite is ready." The elevator's mirrored walls create an endless reflection of them both. A man sculpted by power and a woman the world tried to erase. Grace studies her reflection. The unkempt hair, the tired face. Beside her, Michael, untouched, pristine. He notices her staring and without looking away asks, "Expecting something different?" Grace offers a half smile. "No. Gold just covers the stench." "Of what?" "Of what you step on to get here." Michael suppresses a smirk. "Interesting." Grace holds his gaze. That's what people say when they don't know what to feel. Ding. The elevator arrives. The door to the presidential suite clicks open. Grace steps inside, and it feels like another planet. Floor-to-ceiling windows make the city look like a miniature of lights. The couch looks softer than any bed she's ever slept in. The bathroom, bigger than the rooms she was lucky to find shelter in. But what truly unsettles her is the silence. The kind of silence only the rich can afford. No sirens, no shouting, no distant hum of life struggling to survive. In the walk-in closet, hanging like ghosts, are the dresses, the shoes, the jewelry, all expensive, all perfect, all empty. She touches a dress. The fabric slips through her fingers like water, and for the first time she feels it. "I don't belong here." Michael stands by the door, watching as she takes it all in, but not like someone admiring the grandeur, more like someone inspecting the prison they're about to step into. He steps closer. "What do you think?" Grace, without turning to him. Big, cold, soulless. Michael lets out a quiet chuckle. That's what they call comfort. Grace turns, her gaze unwavering. No, comfort is sleeping without fear. It's eating without guilt. This is just another business deal. Michael stares at her, and for a moment, says nothing. Because deep down, he knows she's right. He opens a cabinet, pulls out a bottle of whiskey and pours himself a drink. He offers her one, but she declines. "You know," he says, swirling the liquid in his glass, "a lot of people would give anything to be in your place." Grace crosses her arms, because they've never seen this place from the inside. Michael raises an eyebrow, intrigued. "And what do you see?" She doesn't hesitate. A cage. Gilded, but still a cage. Michael, taken aback by her honesty, observes her closely. "You're different." Grace gives a cold smile. "No, I'm not. I just don't pretend." Michael, more serious now. "Let's get something straight. This," he gestures around, "is temporary. You don't owe me anything beyond presence. But while you're here, you're expected to behave like your wife?" Grace interrupts. "Like someone appropriate." Michael corrects, choosing his words carefully. Grace steps closer, her eyes piercing into his. "Appropriate. For you or for them?" Michael holds her gaze. For both. Grace. Voice low but firm. I don't wear masks. Just clothes. Later, the suite is dimly lit. Grace sits on the windowsill, looking down at the city. Outside, real life continues. Honking cars, sirens, tiny glowing windows holding real stories. Behind her, Michael unbuttons his shirt, watching her silhouette against the glass. You'll get used to it, he says from across the room. Grace doesn't turn. To what? This world. Her voice is quiet but sharp. This world gets used to us. And then, it swallows us whole. Michael stays silent and turns off the light. Alone, Grace slides down the wall, sitting on the floor. The plush carpet is almost uncomfortable for someone who slept on concrete. Her hand brushes against the ground and her mind drifts. How many are sleeping outside tonight? How many, like me, feel invisible despite all these lights? In the bedroom, Michael lies down, but sleep doesn't come. Grace's words echo in his mind. Comfort is sleeping without fear. He realizes he's never known that feeling. His world has always been a battle. But has he ever felt fear? As the city glows outside, two worlds collide inside that suite. No words are spoken, but one thing is clear. This isn't just a bet. It's a battle, and no one will walk away unscathed. The first morning arrives gray, with the city wrapped in a light mist. The suite's glass walls frame the world outside, but Grace doesn't look at them. She's in the bathroom, staring at her reflection as if trying to recognize herself. Hot water still drips from her hair and the thick towel feels too heavy. Her clean skin should be a relief after weeks without a proper shower, but it's not. It's just another mask, another layer of armor. On the counter, an array of expensive beauty products, creams, perfumes, makeup brands she can't even pronounce. What is she supposed to do? Disappear inside the woman these products promise to create? Grace picks up a perfume bottle, opens it, smells it. It's empty, a scent without a face. She snaps the lid shut and pushes it away. When she steps out, Michael is already at the table, scrolling through his phone, a cup of coffee beside him. The folded newspaper on the table bears the headline, Millionaire Michael Bennett shocks with surprise marriage. Love or scam? Michael looks up when she enters. Sleep well? Grace pulls out a chair. The scent of coffee reminds her of the mornings when, if she was lucky, she'd get a lukewarm cup at the shelter. Now, sitting in front of a table overflowing with fruit, bread, and fresh juice, her stomach knots. I've had worse beds, she says, pouring herself a black coffee. Michael, ever the observer. And better ones? Grace meets his gaze for a moment. The best ones are the ones you don't sleep in alone. Michael doesn't respond, just watches her. He puts his phone down. We need to talk about the arrangement. Grace crosses her arms. I'm listening. He pulls out a leather folder. Inside, papers, contracts, clauses. For the next 30 days, you'll accompany me to events, cocktails, dinners, maintaining appearances. He pauses. The press will speculate you don't respond. Grace tilts her head. And if they ask who I am? Michael meets her gaze, then coldly. My wife. That's enough. She doesn't look away. And what are you to me? Michael smirks slightly. The man who's going to pay you $100,000 at the end. Grace exhales a dry laugh. Just like that? Just like that. She pushes the contract back toward him. I'm not signing this. Michael raises an eyebrow. No. Grace leans back, crossing her arms. This paper is yours. My contract was made when I got in the car. This, she gestures around, is your cage, not mine. Michael studies her with that sharp, calculating gaze he always uses in negotiations. But this time he feels something different. A spark. So you play without rules? He challenges. Grace smirks, but there's no sweetness in it. I play, by surviving. Hours later, the soft echo of heels clicking against marble fills the hotel lobby. Grace walks beside Michael, now dressed in an elegant ensemble. The clothes, though expensive, still make her feel like she's wearing a costume. As they pass, eyes follow. The receptionist's gaze is different this time. Not disdain, but something worse. Venomous curiosity. And then, the click. Paparazzi. A flash, then another. Grace! Grace! One of them shouts. How does it feel to marry a millionaire? She narrows her eyes but gives no response. Michael's hand presses lightly against her back. Not affection, guidance. Like an actor nudging a co-star into the next scene. And she understands. Back in the suite, Grace kicks off the heels into the corner. Her feet throb. They're not used to these leather prisons of pain. Michael loosens his tie, unhurried. You handled it well. Grace dryly. I know how to swallow words. The world taught me that for free. Michael, his tone neutral. That's what's expected. She turns to him, eyes sharp. They expect me to smile? To be a doll? Michael crosses his arms. They expect you to pretend. Just like I do. Just like everyone does. Michael's phone vibrates. He answers. Yes? What? His expression hardens. Send me the link. Now. He looks at the screen. A headline glares back at him. Exclusive. Who is Grace Walker, the woman who snagged Michael Bennett? The shocking past. He doesn't want you to know. Below, an old photo. Grace. Standing in a shelter line, her face hollow with exhaustion. Grace sees it over his shoulder and her heart stops. Where? Her voice is barely a whisper. Where did they get that? Michael tightens his grip on the phone, irritation flashing in his eyes. It leaked, and too fast. Grace's face burns. Not with shame, something filthier. It's the world doing exactly what it always has, throwing her back down. Michael bluntly. Them will burn for a few days. Then, it'll pass. Grace whirls toward him, eyes blazing. Pass? For you, everything passes. For me, this sticks. They'll dig through everything. My life. My son. The word slips out, and the air in the room vanishes. Michael notices. Son? Grace presses her lips together. Her chest rises and falls. She hadn't meant to say that. Not like this. Michael's gaze sharpens. You have a son? She looks away. No, I had. The system took him. I lost him when I lost everything. Michael is silent for a long moment. Then, and does he know where you are? Grace meets his eyes, and there's something in them Michael doesn't fully understand. I don't know where he is. Michael, after a pause, says something unexpected. I can find him. Grace narrows her eyes. And why would you do that? Michael, because I can. Grace, no, because you want to buy me, with another currency. Michael holds her gaze. I negotiate. It's what I do. Grace tastes the metallic burn of anger. He is not a currency. Michael, no, he's your weakness. And, maybe, your strength. Grace, voice sharp as a blade. And you think you know everything about strength, don't you? Michael, with unexpected honesty. I know power, control, loss. Grace cuts him off, razor sharp. No, you know, winning. You've never felt loss. Michael, I have, more than you think. Grace, voice low but burning. I lost everything. Family, home, dignity, the world. Ripped it from me with dirty hands. And you think money can buy what's left of me. Michael watches her, and for the first time doesn't know what to say. His phone vibrates again. It's Brian, his friend and lawyer. Michael, the media smells blood. They want interviews. I suggest you control your wife. This past is dangerous. Michael's eyes stay on Grace, her back to him, fists clenched. And he answers without looking away. No, she's the danger. And hangs up. Grace turns, surprised by what she just heard. And in that moment, something shifts. Because for the first time, Michael didn't see her as a price. He saw her as a force. The suite's living room is heavy. The air feels thick, as if the unspoken words are suffocating the space. Michael's phone, still in his hand, carries the venom of that last call. I suggest you control your wife. But control Grace? That word feels useless, like trying to hold back a storm with bare hands. Grace, eyes blazing, steps toward Michael. Her voice is steady but trembling with restrained emotion. Control your wife? That's what they're saying? Michael slips his phone into his pocket. They want to protect the narrative. Grace glares at him. No, they want to protect you. I'm the flaw in this perfect picture, aren't I? His gaze is unwavering. You're not a flaw. You're unexpected. Grace lets out a dry, bitter laugh. Unexpected? That's what you people call it when someone from the wrong side shows up in the photo? Michael, crossing his arms, keeping his composure. The world wants simple stories. You aren't one. Grace takes a step closer. No, I'm what the world hides. I'm what happens when it turns its back. The tension is thick, almost electric. Two worlds, two truths, a battlefield. Suddenly, Michael's phone vibrates again. A notification from a gossip blog. Who is Grace Walker? The dark past of the new Mrs. Bennet. Drug addict, criminal, or gold digger. Grace sees the headline, and the world tilts. She snatches the phone from his hand. Gold digger? Her voice explodes, shattering the air. These parasites. Her voice shakes with rage, her fingers tightening around the phone as if she could crush the lies out of existence. They don't know anything. Nothing. She hurls the phone against the wall. The sharp crack of glass and plastic echoes through the room. Grace turns, face flushed, eyes burning. Do you know what they'll say? That I begged for money to buy drugs? That I slept in shelters because I was lazy? That I lost my son because I'm a monster? Her voice falters. Her chest rises and falls quickly. She feels the sting of tears, but she refuses to let them fall. Michael, serious, watches, but doesn't interrupt. Grace's anger now bleeds into raw pain. I lost my job when the factory shut down. I worked until the last day and walked away with a check that didn't even cover 2 months of rent. She steps forward, eyes locked onto his, daring him to feel it. I sold everything. Everything. First the furniture, then the clothes, and last, hope. Her voice shakes. And when there was nothing left, they came for my son. Said it was better for him. Better. A sob fights to break free. She swallows it down. Better would have been staying with me. Even on the floor. Even starving. I would have given him everything I had left. Silence. A silence that cuts more than any scream. Michael stands still. But inside him, something cracks. He starts carefully. Took him because of money? Grace laughs. But it's hollow. Dead. No, they took him. Because I lost the war before I could fight. Because I was invisible. And then, the final knife. And since I was invisible, he disappeared too. Michael speaks low, but his voice carries a strange weight. I can find him. Grace snaps, her voice like a blade. No. His brow furrows. Why? She steps forward, her face inches from his, her voice boiling. Because you turn everything into currency. Even people. Even me. Michael holds her gaze. And if, this time, I just wanted to help? Grace's voice is razor sharp. You don't know how to help. You only know how to buy. Michael steps back, retrieving another phone from his briefcase. His voice shifts. Cold. Businesslike. The press won't stop. Not with your past out in the open. Grace crosses her arms. And what's your solution, businessman? He looks her straight in the eye. Control the narrative. Grace dry. Translation, lie. No. Michael narrows his eyes. Say the truth they want to hear. The one that sells. Grace stares at him, fire in her gaze. Your truth, Michael. The only one the world accepts. Grace steps closer, her voice now a sharp whisper. The world accepts what feeds it. Pain, tragedy, and power. Your power. Michael holds her stare. Power is survival. Grace challenges him. Power is knowing how to lose and still keep going. Have you ever lost, Michael? Something you couldn't buy back? Michael doesn't answer. Grace, seeing the crack in his armor. No, you haven't. You've collected victories. And now, you're trying to buy my pain, because it's the one thing you don't know how to have. Michael turns abruptly, his voice coming out raw, unfiltered. I have lost. Grace stops. The air between them stills. Michael continues, his voice heavier. I lost my father. Too soon. I grew up in a business, not a home. I learned that weakness was a luxury, and that no one saves you. He steps closer, his voice lower, but sharp. You think I don't know what it is to fight? I fought. The world. I just chose never to lose again. Grace holding his gaze. And in the end, you won, but you lost yourself. Michael doesn't respond, because deep down, her words hit something he spent years trying to silence. The silence between them is heavy now, not with war, but with recognition. Then Grace speaks, lowering her guard but not surrendering. I don't need you to find me. I need to find myself. Michael, voice quiet. And what if both could happen? Grace watches him, and for the first time there's something in her eyes that isn't just a fight. It's doubt. Because maybe the true cost of this bet is what they'll discover in each other. The clock reads 2 a.m. The city glows beyond the glass windows, but inside the presidential suite the light is dim, casting long shadows over the luxurious furniture. Michael sits on the couch, legs crossed, a glass of whiskey in hand. His phone, resting beside him, has remained silent since Brian's last call. Across the room, Grace stands on the balcony. The wind lifts her hair as she looks down at the city. Those towering, illuminated buildings had always seemed out of reach. Now, she's inside one, but feels even further away. The tension between them hasn't dissolved since their last argument. Words still hang in the air like dust after a collapse. Michael doesn't call her. He just watches. And Grace ignores him until the silence becomes too heavy. Are you afraid? Michael finally breaks the invisible wall between them. Grace turns slowly, her dark eyes reflecting the city behind her. Of what? Her voice is neutral, but full of meaning. Michael swirls the amber liquid in his glass before taking a sip. Of what you can't control. Grace smirks, humorless. What do you think my life has been until now? Michael studies her for a moment before answering. Hell. Her smirk vanishes. Hell. Created by people like you. Michael grips his glass slightly tighter but doesn't argue. Because deep down, he knows it's true. Grace crosses her arms, her gaze steady. Tell me the truth, Michael. Her voice is a sharp whisper. Why did you take this bet? Michael tilts his head, studying her. Because I don't lose bets. Liar. His eyes narrow slightly. You wanted to prove a point. Grace steps closer. You wanted to show that money can buy anything. Michael lets out a dry laugh. And can't it? Grace holds his gaze. It buys time. It buys presence. But it doesn't buy worth. Michael raises an eyebrow. And you think you have something my money can't buy? Grace steps even closer, inches from him. Yes, my truth. For a brief moment, something flickers in his eyes. Something unsettled. Michael rises slowly, his eyes locked onto hers. Then tell me, Grace, what is your truth? She takes a deep breath, and for the first time, speaks without holding back. I grew up hearing that hard work leads to success, that if I just tried hard enough, everything would work out. Her eyes shine with anger and pain. But then, one day, the factory I worked at shut down, and rent went up, and government aid was cut. Her fists clench. And suddenly, trying hard wasn't enough, because the world had already decided I wasn't worth saving. Michael doesn't blink. And then, when I asked for help, Grace lets out a bitter laugh. You know what they said? Get a job. As if no one had already stolen every opportunity before I even got there. She runs a hand through her hair, trying to contain the storm inside her. So tell me, Michael, if money fixes everything, why does it never reach the people who need it the most? Michael stays silent. Grace exhales heavily. Because that's the truth. She gestures toward the city. The world feeds off people like me, people who work for scraps, who sleep on the floor and wash the dishes of those who never get their hands dirty. The system needs losers so that you can keep winning. Michael looks away for the first time. Grace notices and smiles without joy. I know I'm right, because if I wasn't, you would have already told me so. Silence weighs between them. Grace's breathing is still uneven. Michael stands motionless. Then he exhales, running a hand down his face. You're not wrong. Grace frowns, caught off guard. Michael continues. The system is designed to keep things the way they are, to keep me here, and you where you were. He looks at her, and for the first time, his eyes seem tired. But I learned to play by the rules that existed, and I won. Grace crosses her arms. Winning doesn't mean you were right. Michael smirks slightly. And losing doesn't mean you were wrong. She holds his gaze for a long moment. And against her will, she feels something, a flicker of understanding. And that scares her more than anything. The tension in the room remains thick as the clock hits 3 a.m. Grace glances at the couch, then at the bed in the other room, then back at Michael. Where do you sleep? He shrugs. Wherever I want. The suite is yours too. She raises an eyebrow. Do you really mean that? Michael smirks but doesn't answer. Grace exhales, exhausted. I don't need luxury. Just a place where no one will rip me off the floor in the middle of the night. Michael understands. Then pick a corner. You have 30 days. She turns and walks toward the bedroom. But before closing the door, she says, without looking back, 30 days is too long. Michael, alone in the room, watches the door close. And for the first time, he wonders, is it? Grace leans against the door, closes her eyes, and takes a deep breath. Michael stares at his reflection in the window, and both realize this game just became much more dangerous. The day rises slowly. The city wakes with honking cars, hurried footsteps, and overlapping voices. But in the presidential suite, silence still reigns. Michael sits in the armchair sipping coffee. He didn't sleep well. The previous night still echoes in his mind. The tone of Grace's voice, the sharp words that cut deeper than he wanted to admit. The bedroom door opens. Grace steps out, wearing a silk robe that clearly isn't hers. Her damp hair reveals she's recently showered. Michael lifts his gaze but says nothing. Grace crosses her arms. Are you going to say good morning? He spins the coffee cup between his fingers. I'm not sure if it is. Grace smirks. Depends on your point of view. She sits at the table and takes in the breakfast spread. Perfectly sliced fruit, an array of breads, eggs cooked with surgical precision. She picks up a piece of bread and chews slowly. Michael watches. She raises an eyebrow. What? Am I not allowed to eat? You are. Then why are you looking at me like I'm about to dismantle the silverware and sell it on the black market? Michael suppresses a small smile and takes another sip of coffee. Habit. Grace holds his gaze for a moment before going back to eating. The silence lingers between them, but it's not uncomfortable. It feels like they're both waiting to see who speaks first. Finally, Michael sets his cup down and says, "The press won't leave you alone." Grace exhales. "So that's it? We're picking up where we left off?" He nods. "Yes." Grace leans back in her chair, arms crossed. "And what's the plan, businessman?" Michael picks up the folded newspaper next to his coffee and places it in front of her. Scandal or con? Who is the woman who snagged Michael Bennett? Below the headline, a picture from their wedding, and another, from years ago, in a homeless shelter. Grace feels her stomach turn. Michael, impassive. They'll keep digging. She takes a deep breath but keeps her voice steady. "And what do you suggest, that I disappear?" Michael's gaze is serious. "I suggest you feed them before they decide to devour you." Grace frowns. Was that a metaphor or a warning? Michael leans forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Both." She lets out a dry laugh. "And what do you want me to do? Sit down with a reporter and make up a pretty story?" Michael holds her gaze. "No. Just show them the part of the truth they can swallow without choking." Grace exhales slowly. "You want to manipulate the narrative?" Michael simply gives a half smile. Grace shakes her head. "And if I don't want to play this game?" Michael raises an eyebrow. "Then they'll write the story without you. And trust me, you won't like their version." Before Grace can respond, Michael's phone rings. He answers. Brian's voice on the other end is tense. "Michael, have you seen what just came out?" Michael frowns. "What?" "They found out about Luke." Michael goes silent. Brian continues. "They published that Grace lost custody of her son due to negligence, that she was unfit to raise a child. They're painting her as a criminal, Michael." Grace watches his expression shift. Michael pinches the bridge of his nose. "Send me the link." Seconds later, his phone vibrates again. Michael reads the headline aloud. Michael Bennett's secret wife and her dark past, the son she lost to the system. Grace feels her throat tighten. Michael exhales deeply and looks at her. "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" Grace looks away. "I just didn't know when." The silence is heavy. Then Michael speaks. "This can't stay like this." Grace lets out a humorless laugh. "And what do you want to do? Sue them? The damage is already done." Michael stands. "I don't lose battles, Grace." She lifts her gaze to him. "I've lost all of mine. I know what it feels like." Grace walks to the window, staring out at the city. She speaks, but without turning around. "You want to fix this because it affects you, not because of me." The promise was made. Michael and Grace shook hands, sealing an agreement neither of them had expected. But outside that suite, the world wasn't waiting for a story like this to have a happy ending. And the past never stays buried for long. The next morning, Michael receives a call. He answers in his usual neutral, professional tone. "Speak." On the other end, Brian's voice is tense. "Michael, we have a problem." Michael closes his eyes for a brief moment. "When don't we?" Brian sighs. "Someone is selling a story about Grace. Something that could make everything worse." A cold shiver runs down Michael's spine. What did they find? She didn't just lose custody of her son. She also lost the right to look for him. Silence hangs heavy. Michael frowns. "Explain." Brian hesitates, then continues. "The state ruled that she was emotionally unfit to be a mother. They claimed she spent time in a rehabilitation center for abuse survivors, and that was used against her in court." Michael clenches his fists. "So they're saying she—" Brian cuts him off. "It doesn't matter what really happened, Michael. The point is, if this gets out, the media won't just judge her, they'll destroy her." For the first time in a long time, Michael feels something unfamiliar. Helplessness. He hangs up and finds Grace sitting on the balcony, staring at the city. The wind tangles her hair, but she doesn't move. He steps closer. "We need to talk." Grace doesn't take her eyes off the horizon. "I know." Michael frowns. "You do?" She lets out a dry laugh. "They found out, didn't they? About what happened in court?" He nods. Grace closes her eyes for a moment. "I knew this day would come. I just didn't think it would hurt this much." She turns to him, her eyes locking onto his. "Do you want to know what really happened?" Michael doesn't answer, but his expression says everything. Grace sighs. "After I lost my job, I did everything I could to keep paying rent. But the debt kept growing, until a guy from the neighborhood offered to help." She lets out a bitter smile. "Help?" Michael stands still, listening. "He offered me a loan. Small, just enough to cover the basics. And I took it because I was desperate. But the cost of that help came with the first payment." Michael feels his stomach tighten. He's heard stories like this before. "He showed up at my door drunk, said money was never free, and that if I couldn't pay, he knew other ways." Grace's fingers clench the fabric of her robe. "I didn't let him. I fought, but Luke was there. He saw it. And I—" She stops for a moment, takes a deep breath. "I hurt him, Michael. To protect myself. I hurt him." Michael hears the tremor in her voice. "After that, the police showed up. He reported me for assault. The judge saw a mother with no home, no money, facing criminal charges, and the state decided my son deserved a better life. Somewhere else." She lets out a shaky laugh. "They never asked Luke what he wanted. They just decided for him." Michael feels the weight of her story. "And the rehabilitation?" Grace swallows hard. "It was part of the sentence. Emotional adjustment before I could try to get custody back. But after 6 months, they had already given him to another family." She lets out a long sigh. "And I lost him forever." Michael looks at Grace and notices something different. For the first time, he doesn't see her as a piece on a chessboard, nor as a battle to be won. He sees someone crushed by a system he himself has always used to win. And that unsettles him. "You never had a chance," he murmurs. Grace gives a lifeless smile. "Never." Michael remains silent for a while. Then he says something that surprises even himself. "This isn't right." Grace sighs. "And what are you going to do? Buy my son back?" Michael meets her gaze. "If I could, I would." She laughs, but it's a sharp, bitter laugh. "And that's what separates us. You think money fixes everything, but some things, not even all the money in the world can bring back." Michael feels her words like a blow, and, for the first time, he has no response. Hours later, Michael receives another call from Brian. "Michael, the story is already spreading. If we don't act fast, this will turn into the biggest scandal of your career." Michael looks at Grace, who is sitting on the couch, her eyes fixed on the floor. He clenches his fists. This is her story. If someone's going to tell it, it's going to be her. Set up an interview. Brian hesitates. "Are you sure?" Michael looks at Grace again. "Yes." Brian exhales. "Then be ready, because the world is going to listen, and not everyone will like what she has to say." Later, Michael finds Grace in the bedroom. She looks up when he enters. "So, what's the boss's decision?" He sits across from her. "You're going to tell your own story, in your own words." She blinks, surprised. "What?" Michael holds her gaze, firm. I don't want them twisting your truth, but I also want the world to see what it did to you. Grace feels a lump in her throat. And if I don't want to? Michael crosses his arms. Then they'll keep telling it for you. And I can't stop that. She takes a deep breath. Michael leans in slightly. Grace, you've spent your whole life without a voice. I'm giving you a microphone. She holds his gaze. And what do you get out of this? Michael smirks slightly. Maybe. I just want to see you win, for once. Grace feels her chest tighten. And without realizing it, she begins to believe that maybe, this time things could be different. The next day, the interview is set. Grace isn't ready, but she never has been, and that's never stopped her before. The morning starts differently. Grace wakes before the sun. The sky is still a deep blue as she steps out of bed and walks to the window of the suite. The city slowly begins to stir. Lights flicker on in buildings. The first cars take to the streets. But inside her, everything is at war. She agreed to the interview, but now that the moment is approaching, something tightens in her chest. Fear, not of what they'll say, not of the judgment, but of the truth. Saying it out loud makes it real again, and some truths are too heavy to carry alone. Michael is on the living room sofa, already dressed, reading messages on his phone. When Grace walks in, he looks up. Didn't sleep well? She exhales tiredly. I never do when I have to relive the worst day of my life. Michael watches her for a moment, then sets his phone aside. You can still back out. Grace crosses her arms. And let them tell the story their way? No. Michael gives a half smile. I figured you'd say that. Grace takes a deep breath. I just need strong coffee and a good reason not to throw up on live television. Michael stands. I'll handle the coffee. The reason? That's up to you. She lets out a weak laugh. Inspiring. The car glides through the city streets, but to Grace, everything feels slower. In the seat beside her, Michael is focused on his phone. To him, this is just another negotiation. To Grace, it's the biggest battle of her life. When they arrive at the TV studio, flashes explode outside. Paparazzi push forward. Journalists shout questions. Grace, do you want to share your side of the story? What do you have to say about your past? Are you a gold digger? Michael keeps his expression unreadable, guiding Grace through the entrance. She doesn't look to the sides. Her feet are steady, but inside her, everything trembles. Behind the scenes, a producer approaches. He smiles politely, but there's something in his eyes. Something sharp. Grace, can we speak briefly before the recording? She nods, following him into a separate room. Inside, the show's anchor is already waiting. A woman with a calculated gaze and a rehearsed smile. She extends a hand. Pleasure to meet you, Grace. I hope you're comfortable. Grace shakes her hand but feels a chill. The anchor picks up a clipboard. We just want to clarify a few things before we start. Our audience wants to hear your story, but they also want answers. Grace narrows her eyes. What kind of answers? The anchor tilts her head. People want to know if you really deserve a second chance after all. Losing custody of a child isn't common, is it? Grace feels her breath hitch. The journalist continues. Merciless. Do you think you failed as a mother, Grace? Her world tilts for a second. Michael, watching from the doorway, steps forward. This interview was set up to tell the truth, not to humiliate her. The anchor smiles coldly. The audience loves the truth, but they also love redemption stories. Grace swallows hard. So you want a villain turned heroine? We want people to feel something for you, but it's up to you to decide what that is. Grace's heart pounds. She looks at Michael. He says nothing, because now, this decision is hers alone. The lights turn on. The microphone is adjusted. Grace sits in the interview chair, trying to steady her breath. The anchor smiles at the camera. Today, we're joined by Grace Walker, the woman who married one of the country's wealthiest men. But before that, her life was very different. Grace, what was it like to lose everything? Grace clasps her hands together. Her heart pounds. But then something inside her shifts. She thinks of Luke, of what he would say if he could see her now, and she decides that this time no one will tell her story for her. It felt like being erased, like I stopped existing to the world. The anchor leans forward, intrigued. You lost your son. What exactly happened? Grace takes a deep breath. The system saw me as a problem, not as a mother. They never asked what my son wanted, they just decided I wasn't good enough. But being poor didn't make me a bad mother. It just made me invisible. The anchor looks slightly surprised by the strength in her voice. And now? Do you want to find him? Grace's chest tightens, but her voice remains steady. Wanting? I've always wanted to. What I lack is the power that system took from me. But I'm here now, and I won't ask for permission to exist anymore. Michael, watching from behind the cameras, feels a chill. She's winning, on her own terms. The night is restless. Since the interview aired, the media hasn't stopped talking about it. Grace's story has become fuel for heated debates on TV, on social media, at dinner tables where strangers argue over whether she deserves redemption or if she's still just an opportunist. But for Grace, none of that matters. Only one thing matters now, the phone in her hand, and that message. I saw you. 3 simple words, but loaded with something she hasn't felt in a long time. Hope. Grace sits on the suite's couch, eyes fixed on the screen. Michael watches from his armchair, holding a glass of whiskey. He doesn't say anything, but he notices how she grips the phone as if afraid it might disappear. Finally, he speaks. Are you going to answer? Grace lifts her eyes, hesitant. What if someone's messing with me? Michael tilts his head. And what if they're not? She swallows hard. If it's real, everything could change. With trembling fingers, she types a response. Who are you? She presses send and clutches the phone as if expecting it to explode. Michael watches her in silence. For the first time, he realizes that there's something in Grace no amount of money could ever buy. A courage born from pain. Minutes pass. Nothing. Grace takes a deep breath. Time seems to drag. Michael exhales and stands. Staring at it won't make the reply come faster. She doesn't take her eyes off the phone. And what if they never reply? He pauses for a moment, then says, Then you keep looking, just like you always have. Grace closes her eyes for a second. He's right. But before she can respond, the phone vibrates. A new message. Can we talk? Grace's heart races. Michael notices the change in her breathing. Well? He asks. Grace looks at him. I'm going to find out who this is. She types. Yes? Call me. Seconds later, the phone rings. A shiver runs down Grace's spine before she answers. Hello? For a moment, all she hears is silence. Then, a woman's voice. Soft, hesitant. Grace? Grace freezes. Yes. Who is this? The woman on the other end takes a deep breath. My name is Angela. I knew Luke. The ground beneath Grace disappears. She stands up so fast she nearly drops the phone. What? Angela's voice trembles. I worked in the house where he stayed, after he was adopted. I took care of him. Grace feels her legs weaken. Is he okay? Where is he? Angela hesitates. I don't know where he is now, but there's something you need to know. Michael stands, noticing the tension in Grace's face. She presses the phone to her ear. What? Angela pauses for a long moment before speaking. They lied to you. Luke was never adopted. He was placed in foster care. And then, he disappeared from the system. Grace's world collapses. What? Angela continues, her voice shaking. The last time I heard about him, he was 7 years old. He was in a state-run shelter. After that, no one knows what happened. There are no records. It's like he never existed. Grace's vision darkens. Michael catches her arm before she collapses. They erased my son, she whispers. The phone is still against her ear. Angela speaks quickly. Grace, listen to me. You need to be careful. When I started asking about him, I was fired. Some kids just vanish in the system, and no one asks questions. A wave of nausea rises in Grace's throat. And if he's still out there? Angela hesitates. Then you need to find him before it's too late. The call ends. Grace drops the phone and stumbles back, her hands trembling. Michael watches her. He's seen many expressions in his life, fear, anger, despair, but never one like this. This is the expression of someone who just had their last hope crushed. And in that moment, he makes a decision. Grace. She doesn't respond. Lost in her thoughts, Michael steps closer. We're going to find him. She lifts her eyes filled with pain and doubt. How? I don't even know where to start. Michael presses his lips together. But I do. Grace stares at him, trying to understand. Michael turns and picks up his phone. Brian, I need you to find someone for me. Grace's chest tightens. You're going to use your money to buy answers? Michael meets her eyes. No, I'm going to use it to open doors that should never have been closed. She holds his gaze for a long moment, and for the first time, she thinks that, maybe, he really is on her side. The next morning, Brian walks into the suite with a file in hand. We found something. He tosses an envelope onto the table. Grace and Michael step forward. She opens the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, a single document. An address. Guardian. Unknown. Last recorded location. Child Welfare System, New Orleans. Michael looks at Grace. Looks like we have a destination. She grips the paper tightly. Her heart pounds. And for the first time in years, she has a real lead. Michael grabs the car keys. Are we seeing this through to the end? Grace meets his gaze. And then, she gives the only possible answer. Yes. The phone is still in Grace's hand. The illuminated screen displays a short but powerful message. I saw you. 3 words. Simple. But their meaning crashes over her like thunder. She reads and rereads the message. Her heart beats fast. Who sent this? Luke? Someone who knows him? Or a cruel game by someone who wants to toy with her hope? Michael watches from across the room. He notices the way Grace's fingers tighten around the phone, how her eyes flicker between fear and hope. He approaches slowly. Grace? She doesn't look up. Her breathing is short, uneven. Michael leans in a little more. What is it? Finally, she meets his gaze. But there's a fear in her eyes that he hasn't seen before. She turns the phone toward him. Michael reads the message. His expression doesn't change, but something inside him does. Do you think it's him? Grace swallows hard. I don't know. Michael studies the unknown number. Answer. Grace hesitates. Michael sits beside her. If it's a prank, we'll figure it out fast. If it's real, she finishes the sentence, her voice barely above a whisper. If it's real, everything changes. Grace's fingers tremble slightly as she types. Who are you? She presses send. Michael keeps his eyes on the screen, watching her reaction. Seconds pass. Nothing. Minutes. Silence. Grace exhales heavily and tosses the phone onto the couch. Maybe I was stupid to believe. Michael picks up the phone and places it back in her hand. Maybe not. She grips the device tightly as if it's the last thread of hope slipping through her fingers. Then, the phone vibrates. A new message appears. Not here. St. James Park. Tomorrow. 3 p.m. Grace feels her throat tighten. Michael frowns. This could be dangerous. Grace doesn't take her eyes off the screen. Or it could be my only chance. Michael runs a hand down his face. He doesn't like this. You don't know who's on the other side. Grace stands, meeting his gaze. What if it's him, Michael? What if it's my son? Michael sighs. What if it's a reporter or someone looking for money? Grace crosses her arms. Then I'll find out. But I'm not ignoring this. Michael watches her for a moment. Then he decides. I'm going with you. Grace raises an eyebrow. Oh, sure, because a man like you will totally blend into a public park. Michael smirks. You'd be surprised what I can do when I want to. Grace studies him for a moment. This isn't your fight. Michael answers without hesitation. It is now. The next day, Grace sits on a bench at St. James Park. Her hands are freezing. Michael sits a few meters away, at a cafe, watching everything. The clock reads 2:59 p.m. Grace takes a deep breath. Nothing. The wind rustles the leaves. Children run across the grass. A couple chats near the fountain. But no one approaches her. 3:05 p.m. Her chest tightens. Was it a joke? She's about to stand when a voice comes from behind her. You came. Grace turns quickly. A boy no older than 17 stands there. Simple clothes, watchful eyes. Her heart races. Who are you? The boy hesitates. My name is Josh. Grace frowns. I don't know you, but I know you. Michael, still at the cafe, discreetly rises. He watches every detail. From where? Grace asks. Josh glances around, nervous. From the shelter, where your son was. A jolt runs through Grace's body. Luke, you knew my son? Josh nods. Yes, and I know where he is. Michael slowly approaches. He positions himself next to Grace. Subtle but present. Grace stares at Josh, eyes full of questions. Where is he? Josh bites his lower lip. He was adopted. Grace feels the ground disappear beneath her. Adopted? Josh nods. 2 years ago, by a family in Connecticut. Grace closes her eyes for a moment. 2 years. 2 years without knowing where he was. 2 years without knowing if he was happy. She opens her eyes again. Are they good people? Josh hesitates. Yes, but... Grace grips his arm. But what? Josh lowers his gaze. He doesn't remember you. The words hit her like a punch. Luke doesn't remember her. Her little boy, who once held her hand and promised never to forget. Grace feels her legs weaken. Michael notices and steadies her by the arm. Josh continues. He was very young when he was adopted. He thinks he's always lived with them. The air leaves Grace's lungs. She closes her eyes for a moment. Michael watches, saying nothing. Then she takes a deep breath, and when she opens her eyes, there's something new in them. I want to see him. Josh shakes his head. Grace, I don't know if that's a good idea. Michael finally speaks. Why not? Josh looks between the two of them, uncertain. Because to him, you're strangers now. Silence. Grace crosses her arms. That doesn't mean he doesn't deserve to know the truth. Josh exhales. I'll see what I can do. Grace nods. Thank you. Josh hesitates. If I manage to arrange something, promise me you won't disrupt his life. Michael looks at Grace. She meets Josh's gaze. I just want to see my son, even if it's from a distance. Josh slowly nods. I'll be in touch. Then he turns and walks away. Grace watches until he disappears into the crowd. She doesn't know what will happen, but now there's a chance. The city continues to move around her, but for Grace, everything has stopped. Josh has vanished into the crowd, but his words still echo in her mind. He doesn't remember you. A knot tightens in her stomach. For years, the only thing that kept her sane was imagining that Luke still thought about her, that, somewhere, he remembered the smell of her hair, the sound of her voice softly singing him to sleep. But now, she's just a stranger to him. The cold afternoon breeze brushes against her face, but it's not enough to dry the heat of the tears threatening to fall. Michael stands beside her, and for the first time he doesn't know what to say. He watches the way Grace wraps her arms around herself, as if trying to protect herself from something invisible. Are you okay? His voice comes out softer than he intended. Grace lets out a humorless laugh. Is that a rhetorical question, or do you actually want to know? Michael sighs, running a hand down his face. What do you want to do now? She stares at the ground. I want to run to him. I want to scream his name and tell him I'm his mother. She closes her eyes for a moment, but I know that wouldn't work. Michael watches her in silence. Grace opens her eyes again. So I wait. Michael frowns. Wait for what? She takes a deep breath. Wait for him to want to see me. Michael hesitates. And if he never does? Grace presses her lips together, holding back the pain. Then I'll keep waiting. Michael and Grace return to the car. During the drive, Michael notices that Grace doesn't say a single word. She looks out the window, but she's not really seeing anything. Her mind is somewhere else. When they arrive at the suite, she walks straight to the balcony. Michael watches her for a moment, then walks over to the bar and pours 2 glasses of whiskey. He approaches slowly. Drink. Grace turns to him. Will it make me forget? Michael shrugs. No, but it might help you breathe for a few minutes. She takes the glass but doesn't drink. She just holds the cold glass between her fingers. Michael? She hesitates. If it were you, if you had a child who didn't remember you, what would you do? Michael presses his lips together. I'd do whatever it takes to be remembered. She stares at him. Even if it meant hurting the child? Disrupting their life? Michael looks away. I'm not the best example of someone who puts others' feelings before my own. Grace smirks slightly. I've noticed. They sit in silence for a while, until Grace finally takes a sip of the whiskey. She feels the burn spread, hot like fire in her throat. But at least, she doesn't feel as cold on the inside. Grace's phone vibrates. She looks at the screen, expecting to see Josh's number. But it's a different message. Unknown number. We need to talk. My name is Eleanor Turner. Grace frowns. Michael notices her expression and leans in to see the screen. Who is it? Grace quickly types. Sorry, but I don't know you. The reply comes fast. You don't know me, but I know your son. Grace's heart pounds. Her legs feel weak. Michael reads the message over her shoulder. Pick up. Now. With trembling fingers, Grace types, "Who are you? How do you know Luke?" The response comes seconds later. "I'm his mother." Silence fills the room. Michael and Grace exchange glances. The phone vibrates again. "Can we meet?" Grace feels her chest tighten. She looks at Michael. "What do I do?" Michael crosses his arms. "Do you want to meet her?" Grace feels a knot in her throat. "I want to meet my son. But if this is the only way, then yes." Michael takes the phone from her hands and types, "Where and when?" The reply comes fast. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Willow Cafe, downtown." Michael looks at Grace. "So that's it. You're going to meet the woman who's raising your son." Grace clenches her fists. "And find out if there's still a part of me in him." Night falls slowly. Grace doesn't sleep. She sits on the couch, staring at the phone, waiting for Luke to send a message, to say something. But the screen remains dark. Michael doesn't sleep either. He sits outside on the balcony, a glass of whiskey in hand, lost in his own thoughts. Until, for the first time, he says something even he didn't expect. "Do you think he's happy?" Grace looks at him. "I hope so." Michael exhales a long sigh. "I was never happy." Grace doesn't respond, because for the first time, she understands Michael more than he understands himself. And now, they are both trapped in a wait that could change everything. The sun rises. Willow Cafe awaits. And inside, the woman who now calls Luke her son. And maybe, the answer that could break Grace in two. Michael looks at Grace. She's motionless, but her eyes burn with determination. She has found a path, and nothing can stop her now. The clock reads 9:45 a.m. Willow Cafe is small and cozy, filled with the aroma of fresh coffee mixed with the scent of warm baked bread. People come and go at a leisurely pace, unaware that, for Grace, this isn't just another day. She sits on one of the wooden benches outside, fingers intertwined, clutching her own hands. Michael sits beside her, wearing sunglasses, his posture relaxed, though it hides his absolute attention to everything around him. He always evaluates his surroundings, but today it's different, because today, for the first time, he is not in control, and that bothers him. Grace takes a deep breath. What if she hates me? Michael doesn't answer immediately. He turns the coffee cup in his hands as if weighing the question. She wouldn't have called you if she hated you. Grace lets out a weak laugh. Or maybe she just wants to tell me to my face that I was a mistake in his life. Michael turns to her. If that's the case, can you handle it? Grace clenches her fists. I don't have a choice. Michael watches her for a moment. No, you do. She doesn't respond. Because for Grace, there were never choices, only losses. At 9:58 a.m., a car parks across the street. Grace holds her breath. The passenger door opens and a woman steps out. Eleanor Turner. She's in her early 40s, blonde hair neatly tied in a bun, dressed simply but elegantly. The kind of woman who carries herself with confidence without arrogance. She crosses the street without hesitation. Michael straightens, slightly alert. When Eleanor reaches the table, she stops, looks at Grace, and then she smiles. A sincere smile. Grace Walker? Grace swallows hard. Yes. Eleanor pulls out a chair and sits. For a few seconds, no one speaks. Michael watches everything but doesn't interfere, until Eleanor takes a deep breath and says, "Thank you for coming." Grace presses her lips together. "I wouldn't miss this chance." Eleanor nods. She seems to carefully choose her next words. "I imagine you have a lot of questions." Grace lowers her eyes for a moment. Just one. She looks up, meeting Eleanor's gaze directly. "Is he happy?" Eleanor holds her gaze. Then she smiles. "Yes, very." Grace exhales deeply, as if she has been holding this question inside her for years. He's safe, he's loved, he's an incredible boy, smart, full of life. Grace feels her eyes burn. Eleanor notices and continues, her voice soft but firm. "I know you love him. I know you never wanted to lose him." Grace clenches her fists. "But I did." Eleanor lowers her head slightly. "It wasn't your fault." Michael listens but doesn't speak. This is Grace's fight, and Eleanor knows that too. Grace takes a deep breath. Does he know about me? Eleanor hesitates for a moment. Then, she sighs. No. Grace's chest tightens. She closes her eyes. Eleanor continues. He was only 5 when he was adopted. At the time, we thought it would be best for him to start fresh. Grace holds back tears. "We thought," she repeats bitterly. Eleanor clasps her hands on the table. "I know it sounds cruel, but we just wanted to protect him." Grace stares at Eleanor, torn between pain and anger. Protect him from what? From me? Eleanor doesn't look away. From everything. From pain. From missing you. From the fear that you might never come back. The words hit Grace like a punch. She had never thought about that. Did Luke wait for her? Eleanor sees the conflict in her eyes. For the first few months he asked about you, but over time, he stopped, and then he forgot. Grace feels something shatter inside her. He forgot me. Eleanor reaches across the table. That doesn't mean he can't remember. Grace looks at the woman in front of her. For years, she hated this family without even knowing them. But now, seeing Eleanor, seeing the way she talks about Luke, she understands. They love him, and more than that, Luke loves them. Grace closes her eyes for a moment. When she opens them, her voice is hoarse. "I want to see him." Eleanor doesn't seem surprised, but she hesitates. "Grace, what if this does more harm than good?" Grace swallows hard. "I just want to see my son, even if it's from a distance." Eleanor is silent for a moment. Then she nods. "I can allow that." Grace feels a small weight lift from her chest. Eleanor takes out her phone. "On Saturday, he plays soccer at the park. You can see him there." Grace feels the tears sting her eyes. "Thank you." Eleanor smiles. "Don't thank me. Just be prepared for what comes next." Grace nods. She is. At least she thinks she is. After their goodbyes, Michael and Grace walk back to the car. But before he gets in, Eleanor calls Michael's name. He turns. She hesitates for a moment, then asks, "Does she trust you?" Michael presses his lips together. "I don't know, but I think I'm closer to it than anyone else." Eleanor nods. Then, "Take care of her, because this story doesn't have easy endings." Michael studies her for a moment. "No real story does." Eleanor gives a small smile. "Good luck, Mr. Bennett." Michael nods, then gets into the car. Grace is silent. He starts the engine. And as they drive back home, only one sentence echoes in her mind. Saturday at the park. And nothing in the world feels bigger than that now. Saturday dawns with a pale blue sky, cloudless and calm. Grace hasn't slept. Ever since Eleanor arranged the meeting, time has slowed. The hours have stretched long and heavy, and each passing minute seems to bring a fresh wave of anxiety. Now, sitting in the back seat of Michael's car, she feels her heart hammering in her chest. Michael drives in silence. He notices the way Grace clenches her hands in her lap, how her right foot taps lightly, a nervous tick she probably doesn't even realize. He parks near the park and turns off the engine. There's still time to back out. Grace lets out a dry laugh. "Do you really think I could?" Michael watches her for a moment. "No." She exhales slowly. "Then don't say obvious things, Bennett." He smirks slightly. And then, they both turn back to look ahead. The park is full. Children run across the grass, families have picnics, and the sound of a soccer ball being kicked echoes across the field. Grace's stomach twists. She doesn't know where Luke is, but she knows he's here, and that alone is enough to make her entire body tremble. Grace and Michael step out of the car and walk slowly through the park. The wind carries the scent of grass and damp earth, mixed with the sound of children's laughter. Every step feels heavier, and then she sees him, there, in the middle of the soccer field. A boy with brown hair, slightly taller than she remembers. Blue jersey, white shorts. He runs after the ball, his eyes shining with excitement, a wide smile on his face. Grace feels her legs weaken. Michael notices and places a steady hand on her arm, firm but not pulling her back. She doesn't say anything. She can't. She just watches. Every movement he makes, every laugh. And she realizes that, even after all this time, he is still the same Luke she remembers, but at the same time, he isn't. Luke kicks the ball and then runs toward a tall man with graying hair. Grace recognizes him from the photos. The adoptive father. He ruffles the boy's hair, saying something that makes Luke laugh. Grace's chest tightens. That man, that stranger, is who Luke now calls Dad. And her? She is nothing more than a ghost. She wraps her arms around herself. Michael remains beside her, saying nothing, because he knows this moment belongs only to her. Grace watches as Luke sits on the grass with his friends. They drink water, chat, laugh. Then, one of the boys leans toward him and says something. Luke frowns slightly as if trying to remember something distant. And then, he says something that knocks the air from Grace's lungs. "Did I have another mom?" Her world stops. The woman sitting beside him, Eleanor, smiles, but there's something else in her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart, you did." Luke furrows his brow. What was she like? Grace feels her throat tighten. Eleanor takes a slow breath. She was strong, very strong, and she loved you more than anything in the world. Luke smiles softly. That's nice. And then, he goes back to drinking his water, unaware that just a few feet away, the woman he's speaking about is struggling not to fall apart. Grace feels her heart shatter. He doesn't remember her, but he doesn't reject her either. That should be enough, but it isn't. Michael finally speaks. "If you want to go to him, I'll go with you." Grace squeezes her eyes shut. What if I haunt him? Michael looks at her. Or, what if he's waiting for someone to help him remember? Grace turns her gaze back to Luke. He looks so happy, and that's what hurts the most. Because if she steps into his life now, she could hurt him. And if there's one thing she would never do, it's hurt her son. She takes a deep breath and makes her decision. Grace takes a step back. Michael frowns. "What are you doing?" She looks at him, her eyes filled with tears, but there's an unexpected peace in them. "I waited years to see if he was happy." She looks at Luke again. "Now I know he is." Michael narrows his eyes. "Grace, don't you want to introduce yourself? Just to say hi?" She shakes her head, smiling sadly. "Not now. Maybe. Someday." Michael watches her for a moment, and then he understands. This isn't surrender. It's a sacrifice, and the purest act of love he has ever witnessed. Grace takes another step back. Then she turns and begins walking away from the park. Michael follows her, but before he does, he glances at Luke one last time. He can't explain why, but something inside him says that one day that boy will look in the right direction, and when that day comes, Grace will be waiting. Michael drives slowly. Grace stares out the window, but her mind is elsewhere. He breaks the silence. "Do you want me to try to find him again?" She exhales. "Not now." Michael nods. "So what happens now?" Grace turns to him. Her eyes still hold pain, but they also hold something they never did before. Hope. "Now, I start over." Michael watches Grace, and for the first time, he sees a woman who no longer needs to be saved. She has already saved herself. And now, she's just waiting for the day her son finds her again. And when that day comes, she'll be ready. The days pass slowly. Since the moment Grace chose not to approach Luke, something inside her has changed. She hasn't given up on him. She never would. But for the first time in years, she realizes she needs to stop living only for the past and start living for herself. Michael notices the change in Grace. She spends less time staring at her phone, waiting for messages, and more time looking ahead. But there's something he needs to know before this chapter of their story ends. One night, sitting on the couch in the suite, he looks at her and asks, "If you could change one thing in your life, what would it be?" Grace gives a small smile. The right question would be, "If I could change someone, who would it be?" Michael raises an eyebrow. "And who would that be?" She doesn't hesitate. "You." Michael lets out a short laugh. "And why?" Grace looks at him. "Because you're a man who has everything, but never had anything real." Michael feels the weight of those words. She continues, "And because I want, one day when Luke remembers me, to be able to say that I knew someone who changed, who learned to see beyond his own world." Michael has no response, because deep down, he knows Grace is right. The next day, Michael and Grace have one last conversation. He crosses his arms. "So what happens now?" Grace takes a deep breath. "Now I want something I never had." Michael waits. She smiles. "Independence." Michael isn't surprised. "You want to leave?" Grace nods. "The bet is over, and I don't want to be just another name on your bank statements." Michael watches her for a moment. Then he hands her an envelope. She frowns. "What's this?" "Your money. The $100,000. Grace looks at the envelope, but she doesn't take it. Michael frowns. "Are you refusing?" Grace smiles. "No, but I'll take it only when I know what to do with it. Something that has meaning." She pushes the envelope back to him. "Keep it, for now." Michael lets out a disbelieving laugh. You're unbelievable. Grace shrugs. I'm just trying to be better than I was yesterday. Michael watches her walk away, and he realizes that, maybe for the first time in his life, he has met someone truly free. The next morning, Michael accompanies Grace to the airport. She carries only a small suitcase. Do you know where you're going? He asks. She smiles. It doesn't matter where, only that it's a beginning. Michael nods, but before she leaves, he says, Grace. She turns. He hesitates for a moment, and then finally, he says something he's never said before. Thank you. Grace smiles. Take care, Michael. And with that, she turns and walks away. This time, without looking back. Months later, Michael is in his office. Brian walks in, holding a tablet. Michael, I think you'll want to see this. He hands him the device. Michael frowns at the website of an NGO. On the screen, an article. Project Rebirth, a new shelter for homeless women and children. Michael scrolls down, and then he sees the photo. Grace. She's there, smiling, surrounded by women and children. Something tightens in his chest. She found a purpose. She found a path, and she did it. On her own. Brian watches Michael for a moment. She refused your money, didn't she? Michael gives a small smile. Grace would never accept anything she didn't earn herself. Brian nods. And you? What are you going to do now? Michael looks out the window. And for the first time, he doesn't just see his own reflection in the glass. He sees a different future. And for the first time, he wants to do something with it. Days later, Grace receives an envelope. She opens it, curious. Inside, a check for $100,000. But not for her, for Project Rebirth, and with it a small handwritten note. Now you know what to do with it. Michael. Grace lets out a soft laugh, shaking her head. He finally understands. And deep down, that means more than any money in the world. Grace closes her eyes for a moment. She still doesn't have all the answers. She still doesn't know when Luke will remember her. But now, that no longer defines her. She is more than her past. She is more than her pain. She is free. And that's all she ever wanted. And now I want to hear from you. Did Grace make the right choice by not approaching Luke? What would you have done in her place? Leave a comment below. I read them all. And if you love emotional stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the upcoming stories that will keep you hooked from beginning to end.